the place where the key management and commercial decisions are taken and the decisions that are necessary for the conduct of the business transactions. Insofar as this phrase of at any time during the year, CBDT says it should not be interpreted narrowly, and CBDT will soon come out with guidelines to minimize the assessing officer's discretion. Now, it should not be interpreted narrowly, that is what they are saying. But my point is, why is there a need? And CBDT is saying that's one thing, but what is written? Whatever they have said to the chamber or life or any other organization has ultimately no meaning. What is written would be read. So what is the requirement of at any time during the year? If we just learn the definition of place of effective management. The expression place of effective management has been defined to mean a place where key management and commercial decisions that are necessary for the conduct of the business of the entity as a whole are in substance made. So the definition itself goes to the concept of substance over form. The definition talks about the decisions in substance are made where. You have to see that. Now if the definition itself has this in substance concept, why do you need at any time during the previous year also to further qualify in your amendment? I have had a look at various other countries where this concept of place of effective management is there. Say for example, China has this concept of place of effective management, but it doesn't use this phrase at any time during the year. Italy has it in somewhat near about phrase. It says for greater part of the year. Still, it's not at any time during the year. South Africa has the concept of place of effective management, but it doesn't have at any time during the year. Malaysia probably is the only country which has this phrase at any time during the year. We do not know, there are no case law that I came across in respect of Malaysian cases on this subject. Russia introduced place of effective management in 2014, but it does not have at any time concept at all. And in fact, OECD, the entire basis on which the explanatory memorandum tries to explain that this we want to align with the OECD model commentary, or we want to align with the OECD practice. Therefore, we are bringing about this concept of place of effective management. This itself, OECD itself doesn't have the concept of at any time. It has this concept of substance. In fact, the definition has been picked up straight from there, word verbatim, and it has this concept of in substance, but it doesn't say at any time. So at any time during the year is something which I strongly recommend that the chamber should represent, and that has to go away, because at any time would really mean that there is one meeting in India, there is one decision being taken in India by some executives of the company. Maybe they are in India for some project, maybe for something, whatever. And that major decision being taken in India, which would affect the organization as a whole, the company as a whole, probably it may be regarded as place of effective management. At any time is not required when the definition itself has a concept of substance. How is this relevant from OECD point of view? Basically, the model conventions that we have, all these treaties that we have, would say that residential status would first be examined based on the domestic law, whether a company is a resident or not as per the domestic law. And then if one finds that if an entity is a resident of both the countries, then you apply a tie-breaking test. And in the tie-breaking test, we have this concept of place of effective management. It says that if an entity is regarded as resident of both the countries based on their respective domestic laws, then one has to look at the place of effective management of that company and accordingly determine the place, accordingly determine the residential status for the tax treaty. So that is there in the tie-breaking test. Now, what does the OECD say? As I said, it does not talk about at any time. It talks about substance. An entity, it says that an entity may have more than one place of management, but it can never have more than one place of effective management at any time in the year. The place where actions to be taken by the entity as a whole are in fact determined. It also says place where most senior persons, for example board of directors, and not necessarily only the board of directors, most senior persons, for example board of directors, make the decisions. Decisions are taken at one place, but they are formally formalized at the other place. Then it will be the place where the decisions are taken, the neck and the head. Remember that example. If you are a mere rubber stamp, if the board is a mere rubber stamp, then that's not good. It was good enough so far, but now it's not going to be good enough. So what's the difference between the concept of control and management, which was there so far, and the place of effective management now? Probably, so far whatever I have understood is something like this, that holding of board meetings and taking decisions to the board meetings outside India was a necessary and probably a sufficient condition so far to say that the control and management lies outside India. Now, that condition of holding board meetings and taking decisions outside India would be necessary, but it's not going to be sufficient. So far it was necessary and sufficient. Now going forward it is definitely necessary, but it's not going to be sufficient. You'll have to do much more beyond the mere holding of the board meetings. There are a few international case laws on this issue. There is a lot of discussion which is going on in the BEPS arena. Base erosion and profit sharing, etc., where the movement today is towards determining the residential status in a case of a tiebreaker on a case-to-case basis. And the movement is, it's not finalized, it's all at discussion stage, discussion papers are there. But the movement in the OECD today is that on a case-to-case basis, when there is a tiebreaker, when there is a tie of residential status, on a case-to-case basis, the competent authorities of two countries should determine whether the entity is a resident of one country or the other. And in determining that, there are 2 or 3 criteria which are necessary. One of them is place of effective management, the other is a country of incorporation, and certain other factors which the authorities may consider as relevant. Now, in the context of all this, the case laws and the discussion on BEPS, etc., I have tried to list down 6 or 7 items which repeatedly come every now and then as to the tests of determining the place of effective management. And these are as follows. Certainly place where board meetings are held, as I said, it is necessary, but now not sufficient. Place where the CEO, Chief Executive Officer, or other senior officers usually carry out their activities. Now these activities are management activities, not the ground activities of doing business. There's a difference between managing a business and actual conduct of a business. So senior officers and CEOs carry on their activities of managing the business. Then, place where the company's headquarters is located. You're reporting, everybody is reporting there. Which country's laws would govern the legal status? Mainly the country where it is incorporated or registered. Place where the accounting records are maintained, that is an indicator of effective management as well. And in terms of tax treaties, we are also told that one of the tests should be that by artificially becoming a resident of one country, are you evading certain tax treaties, or are you misusing certain tax treaties? That is also another test. Now, having regard to all this, I just tried to work out what are the type of safeguards that one will have to look at if we have to live with this provision and make sure that nothing goes wrong. But before the safeguards, a couple of other things let me say. As CBDT said that we are targeting Indian companies which are abroad, and they are only holding board minutes outside India. So, several subsidiaries of Indian companies whose board would comprise of executives and employees or senior executives of the holding company. They are the directors of that company. And 2 or 3 times in a year they go there, hold meetings, come back. And that company is regarded as a resident outside India, incorporated outside India. These are the companies which are going to be affected the most. In the context of those companies, such type of companies, it will now not be sufficient to have your, or it will be suicidal to have your own employees as your directors over there. You will need an independent board, especially people who are non-residents of India. Another consequence of this could be that India would recognize that foreign company, that type of foreign company as an Indian resident. So, and that company may also therefore be a resident of the country where it is incorporated. So it will be taxed in both the countries as a resident. And then if it has a treaty, the treaty takes you back to the concept of place of effective management. And then place of effective management, if under the Indian law is India, probably under the treaty also will be India. And I am presuming that the alignment which they make under the rules would really be an alignment, the thinking as it is as it is internationally, and not just the thinking of the tax department so more. So therefore, the consequence would be that the entire world income of such an entity, which is a name-plate company over there, your employees are the directors over there, that type of a company would probably now, the entire income, world income, would be taxable in India, irrespective of whether it is accruing in India, arising in India or not, that's immaterial, because it will be regarded as a resident. Now in this scenario, the companies which are going to be affected most are also the companies which set up special purpose vehicle outside India, especially from the point of view of funding the acquisitions. Now we have several large corporates acquiring businesses in various parts of the world, and for acquisition of business you have to raise funds, and you find at a given point of time funds are available cheaply in Singapore, they are cheaply available somewhere else, etc., and therefore you start creating structures that yes, I will have a company in Singapore, I will have a company in Netherlands, and then underneath that I will have the acquisition which I am making ultimately. There's also a commercial reason why you create that type of a structure, because ultimately you want the lender's safety. It is at times governed also by lenders. Because if the first level, if the payout fails, the first level fails, the second level does not fail. So in order to hedge the risk of various lenders, you create these structures. And in creating these structures, you have subsidiaries in various companies across the globe. Good, sound commercial reasons, no doubt about it. These are the companies which as of today you say that controlled and managed outside India, board meetings held outside India, no tax, not a resident in India. Now these are the companies which will clearly become tax residents of India if the control and management or place of effective management would be regarded as in India. They are just there for raising funds or for some other commercial reasons. There is no activity as such over there. There may be good patent laws, and therefore I want patents to rest in that country, and therefore I have a subsidiary in that company. Just because there is a good law, there is something which protects my patents, I want my patents to rest there, and therefore I have a company over there. Those are the companies which will be affected the most by this particular provision. So therefore, coming finally to the safeguards. What are the safeguards that one can think of at this point of time? Of course, as and when we make mistakes, we will learn and we will improve ourselves. But as of today, let's try not to make mistakes. Number one, independent board of directors have to be there. Have robust minutes, elaborate minutes. All deliberations should be documented over there. Number two, ensure that not a single board meeting is held in India. In case of video conferencing, directors taking part in video conferencing, make sure that the host country is not India, host country is a country outside India. Because it is the laws of that host country which are relevant for the cyber laws, etc. Then the charter of the company or the powers in the articles of association or the appointment letters of your key executives, the power should be for powers should be given for exercising their activities or controlling activities outside India. Registered office, of course, should be a foreign country. The parent's role in this entire holding subsidiary relationship should be that of giving a vision or a direction. It should not be that of controlling. So, in other words, the parent would give the direction, okay, what I would like you to do, what I would like you to pursue. But not how are you going to pursue it. That how has to be left to the decision. That is the conduct of the business. Place where the decisions, management decisions as regards conduct of the business. That is the language of place of effective management. So the parent may say what to do in terms of policy direction, but how that has to be achieved is not something which the parent should ideally say. If the parent is in India, there is a possibility of it being regarded as an place of effective management if that interference goes to the extent of how the subsidiary should do something. The parent's interference also should be limited to protect its own interests as a shareholder and not to take the control of the affairs of the company. And same should be with the nominees of the parent company who are nominated on the board of the company. Certainly general meetings are to be held outside India. All communication should be recommendatory in nature and not directory in nature. And the most important thing, one will have to review the websites of the parent company and subsidiary thoroughly to make sure that that control management is not even disclosed, not even projected to be with the parent company in India. Because we write a lot of things on our website to show that I am a global giant, and therefore I'll end up making statements which ultimately can be interpreted that the control lies with me over here. So need to review the websites thoroughly from this point of view. I've had a look at some of the countries, important countries, and I find that this concept of place of effective management is still not there in their list of them. Say for example, UK still has a concept of central control and management. We have our laws from the UK. So we continued that for so many years. UK still has the concept of central control and management and not that of place of effective management. Germany doesn't have, Singapore doesn't have, Australia doesn't have, Brazil doesn't have, France doesn't have, so on and so forth.
Directorship between the Indian company and the foreign company when they have common board of directors, they will impact the reputation.
So, merely because a person is common may not be the ground. It's where that person is managing the affairs. So
what will happen in the reverse situation? Suppose there is a company Y Limited incorporated outside India. The company X Limited is a 100% subsidiary of holding subsidiary in India. And since there is a common director, and just because since the managing director of the holding company outside India, and he is a vice president over here, and just because his MD is not working, he is on leave, and the key management decision was taken by the vice president who is present in India. So will that become a place of
you're right. So therefore, the definition protects you because the definition looks at the substance. Okay. But the danger here is the way your tax officer may interpret at any time during the year is something which is in danger. The example that you are giving could be the right example, and there could be a number of such examples where this concept of somebody is absent and in his absence at any time during the year. So what is at any time during the year? It's absolutely not required. It's not there in any law except for Malaysian law, and I have not found much material on the Malaysian law as to what is happening over there. So your point is well taken. There could be difficulties because of these words.
Excuse me, I think we'll keep the question. There's many things to say.
Okay. So, yeah, residential status will. Next. Yeah, this one is residential status.
Effective management.
Residential status does not want to change. Okay. Let's go on to indirect transfers. Okay. Indirect transfers, the provision that came in the statute book, as rightly mentioned, the initial part of the seminar. The provision that came of the statute book as a result of the Vodafone's case. That's all. Where you have a situation where, in this particular slide, which is really the Vodafone's case, which is depicted over there, a simplified form. You have the company on the top left, that Netherlands company, who was the Vodafone company, was the purchaser of shares. The shares of the target company was a CGP in the middle, which ultimately owned through several other layers, it owned company in India, the Hutchison SR Limited Indian company. And the shares, with what was transferred were the shares of CGP by that BVI company just on the top of that CGP. So BVI company was a seller, Netherlands company was a purchaser of the shares of CGP. CGP was a target company. And as a result of this transaction, which was out and out, which was a transaction which was entirely outside India, shares of one foreign company acquired by another foreign company, and transaction taking place outside India, just because the ultimate value came from the assets in India. The Bombay High Court initially held that this amounts to transfer of capital assets situated in India, and thereafter the matter went up to Supreme Court, and Supreme Court decided the issue in favor of the SSE, saying that there is no transfer of any capital assets situated in India. Now, with a view to overcome the decision of the Supreme Court, we found this amendment happening in Finance Act 2012, where they made this amendment retrospectively. They amended the provision of transfer under 247, the definition of capital asset in 214, and the concept of deemed accrual in section 9, and by this amendment they nullified the effect of the decision of the Supreme Court, and therefore today we have a situation where in this example, foreign company 1, below that foreign company 2, and below that is the Indian company. So if foreign company 1 were to transfer the shares of foreign company 2 to another foreign entity, although there is no shares of Indian company being transferred, that transfer would be regarded as taxable event in India because of the amendment of 2012. Going back, this retrospective amendment was brought so far as section 9 was concerned. Explanation 5 was added to section 9(1), and it said that for removal of doubts, it's hereby clarified that an asset or a capital asset, being a share or interest in a company or entity registered or incorporated outside India, shall be deemed to be and shall always be deemed to have been situated in India, if the shares or interest derives directly or indirectly its value substantially from the assets located in India. So coming back to this diagram, the shares held by F1 in F2 are, normally speaking, they are shares of foreign companies situated outside India. But because the value of the shares of F2 is substantially from the Indian assets or the value of the Indian company shares, and therefore the transfer of shares by F1 to a third party would be regarded as taxable in India, because the shares of F2 derives its value substantially from the Indian company. And since it derives its value substantially from the Indian company, F2 shares will be deemed to be located in India, and deemed to be located means that the transfer of those shares, it will be liable to capital gains tax in India. The question arose as to what is the meaning of substantial. That is how this 2012 amendment was worded. And we had the matter, in one of these matters, reached the Delhi High Court in the case of Gopal Research. And the Delhi High Court took a view that, look, if the value, if the shares of a company incorporated overseas derives 50% or more of its value from assets situated in India, would be regarded as deriving its value substantially from the assets situated in India. So that substantially how much it should be, that 50% was the benchmark set by the Delhi High Court. This is a benchmark which we also find in the direct tax code proposals. Of course, that is now shelved, but several direct tax code proposals have been incorporated in the Act somewhere or the other. Now, that was also there, as I said, 50% was there in DTC, and now we have this amendment to provide a mechanism for determining the value substantially from the assets in India, and that is what this amendment is all about. So, what does this amendment say? Share or interest of F1 in F2 shall be deemed to derive its value substantially from the assets located in India, if on the specified date the fair market value exceeds 10 crores and represents at least 50% of all assets owned by F2 without reducing the liabilities. So, two things. Although I feel the way the section is worded is extremely confusing. It says fair market value of such assets. Prior to that, they are saying assets located in India. So one tries to think that when it talks of fair market value of such assets being more than 10 crore, is it referring to the assets located in India? The answer is wrong. It's not that way. When they are referring to such assets, they are really referring to the shares of F2. Because those shares are the capital asset which they are talking about, which are subject matter of transfer. So, if the value of the Indian company shares is more than 10 crores, and if the value of the Indian company shares is more than 50% of the total assets of F2, right? In that case, there will be a tax event triggered under this new provision which came in 2012. So, they are now trying to define under what situation it will be taxed, under what situation it will not be taxed. Then, they are saying you have to look at this fair market value on which date? There is a specified date. What is a specified date? Specified date is means the last day of the accounting period preceding the date of the transfer, or the date of transfer if the book value exceeds 15%. Extremely confusing the way it has been drafted, but let me try and make it simple as much as possible. Accounting period of that F2 is, say, for example, January to December 2015. Now, F1 sells the shares which it holds in F2, say in the month of June 2015. So the specified period is what? the specified period, specified date rather, the date on which you have to see that 10 crore limit. What is that? It would be 31st December 2014 in a normal situation. Okay? However, you have to also see the book value of the assets of F2 in June 2015 compared to the book value of the assets of F2 on 1st January 15. If the difference is 15% or more, then forget December 14, you have to take 1st June 15 as a specified date, or the date of transfer as a specified date. So that is the mechanism which they want us to adopt. Going forward, they are saying under certain situation when the ultimate holder has a very small interest or it has virtually no interest, we will not bother you with this provision. And what is that? In this situation, F1 is selling the shares of F2 to another foreign company, F3. And they are saying, we are told that income will not be deemed to accrue or arise in India if F2 directly owns the asset. That is there, F2 directly owns the Indian company. But it does not hold right of management or control or voting power or share capital or interest exceeding 5% of the total voting power, share capital of interest in relation to F2 at any time. So in other words, if F1 holds less than 5% in F2 and it transfers the shares, then they are saying we will not bother you with this deeming provisions. Or if F1 holds in F2, no controlling interest, no right to management and control. So neither right of management and control, nor more than 5%. You may have right of management and control even without having 5% stake because of you are a lender or something else, then you are still in trouble. So you should neither have more than 5%, nor you should have any right of management and control. If that is the situation, then those smaller transactions, we are told, will be outside the tax limit. There is one more thing which has not come out in this slide is that F2 does not hold only Indian assets, it holds several other assets. Now you have made a test of substantially because you said it's more than 50%. But fine, when the test is satisfied, the tax gets triggered. But how much will you tax in India? You can't tax the value of the entire F1 shares. So you will have to tax only that part of the value which is attributable to the Indian assets and not attributable to several other assets. And therefore we are told that they will come out with rules of prorating the consideration and the profits in such a manner that only the profits which are attributable to the value which is derived from the Indian assets will be taxed, others will not be taxed. Huge valuation exercise when you have a huge network of companies will have to be done. Lots and lots of work for us chartered accountants as valuers. And the companies will have to provide the data. The most important thing is that the Indian company will have to provide the data of its structure and the transactions which has taken place outside India. And I don't really know how that data can really be available. Anyway. So this is one type of transaction. The other type of transaction is almost the same, but they have complicated it by adding a few more layers in between. So the first type of transaction was where F2 holds directly in the Indian company. The second type of transactions which they have described is it holds indirectly in the Indian company, but the test of 5% and management and control, everything else is the same. I'm not going into it, just to make two different provisos, difficult to understand on first reading, first 5 readings you need to actually understand what they want to say. So therefore I thought I will make a diagram to really myself understand. Then, if the shares in the foreign shareholding entity are transferred in an amalgamation, now these are some exemptions which are given, that in case of amalgamations and demerger, if there are transfers happening, indirect transfers happening, we are going to examine it. And there are conditions, the normal conditions for exemptions that are there in amalgamation and demergers of foreign company. They are there. That at least 75% of the shareholders should remain the same in a merger or a demerger, and that merger or a demerger should be tax neutral in that country in which that merger or demerger happens. If those two conditions are satisfied, we are told that even India will not tax you on that type of merger or demerger. And as a consequence of that, because that merger, in the course of merger, demerger, you happen to acquire the shares of that F2, you are told that as and when at a later stage when you sell the shares of F2 which derives its value from India, then the cost of acquisition will be the cost of acquisition to the previous owner. So that 47, 49, whatever normal provisions that we have been brought in over here. Then, as I said, most important, furnishing of information or documents by the Indian concern has been inserted in section 285A, and I wonder as to how the Indian company would be privy to all that information about the shareholders changing hands outside India. It's going to be a challenge, but then you have this task of providing something which you may not possess. So I really don't know whether you can say that this penalty is not workable at all. You cannot ask me what I don't have. So if I have something and I don't give you, you may penalize me, but you can't ask me to provide which I am not supposed to have. I'm after all a subsidiary, an operating subsidiary. There's a large multinational group. I'm one of the operating subsidiaries of the group as a whole. How would an operating subsidiary know what its parents and the grandparents are doing? So, but that is what they have made the law here, and I'm sure in some fit cases somebody will challenge these provisions. That look, I'm not supposed to, because we have all dealt with the Indian companies, and when you ask data, even if you are transfer pricing, you ask data, you are given selected data by the parent company. Now, how this is going to happen? There's going to be a lot of challenge on this. And what is the penalty? Penalty is 2% of the transaction value of 5 lakh rupees. 2% of the transaction value, huge penalty. For just not furnishing the data. That fellow might have paid his tax, but I have not furnished the data, so penalize me. And if there is a reasonable cause, there will be no penalty, so I don't know what is a reasonable cause would be. Okay. Interest, now that's all your indirect transfers. Let's go to interest paid by banks. Interest paid by banks to foreign head office or branches. So you have a situation where a foreign bank has an Indian branch, and that foreign bank has branches all over the world. The Indian branch debits the interest cost, which is based on the head office on the funds provided by the head office to the branch. What is the law as on today as regards one? Taxability of that interest in the hands of the HO in India, and the allowability of that expenditure in the hands of the Indian branch when it computes its profits for Indian tax purposes. So far as taxation is concerned, the HO and the branch is one entity, is that foreign company. Person cannot make profit out of oneself. I cannot pay myself and say offer that what I pay to myself as income. And therefore, what that foreign company receives or that head office receives is not income, and therefore it cannot be charged to tax in India. Insofar as allowability is concerned, Section 911 says that profits out of Indian operations have to be taxed only. When you go to the DTA, we are told your branch is a PE. Yes, branch is a permanent establishment. What profits have to be taxed? Profits have to be taxed as if that PE is an independent entity working on its own, independent of the head office. So therefore, you have to compute profits attributable to that PE. When I compute profits attributable to that PE, what do? If the head office had provided me the borrowed funds, and therefore it would allocate certain interest cost to me, then that interest cost will certainly be allowed. But merely because the head office has funded me, I will not debit that interest cost as an expenditure in my books. That's to my mind the correct legal position. However, certain tax treaties say clearly They say that the interest expenditure paid by the PE to its head office will not be allowed except in the case of banks. The treaties provide for that. Many of the treaties provide for that. So therefore, for all practical purposes, the Indian PE, the Indian branch would claim that interest payment to HO is a reduction when it computes a profit. However, the HO will not offer that income for tax, and that is what your income tax department did not like. And therefore, this amendment. They brought about a circular earlier to say that there should be a TDS done by the branch when it pays interest to the HO. Circular was considered, and you have a decision of the special bench, which I have quoted over here, Sumitomo. After considering the circular, after considering all these concepts, a person cannot make out profit out of oneself, tikawai, pension, etc., etc. Special bench came to a decision that so far as taxation is concerned, there is no tax, there is no requirement to do a TDS. So far as allowability is concerned, because the treaty provides so, allowability has to be granted. That position is now changed, and now we are told that the now we are told that the interest. First we are told that the permanent establishment will be deemed to be a separate person. Once it is deemed to be a separate person, therefore, the head office will be taxed on that interest income in India. The explanatory memorandum also says that you have to do a TDS on that. The branch will have to do a TDS on that. Now, this amendment they have brought about by bringing about an explanation which is added to section 915. One question survives over here. The taxability of interest, insofar as the Act is concerned, they have brought about this amendment. Taxability of interest in a treaty situation, does it make any difference? Is there any difference? Answer to my mind is yes. This provision will not apply where you have a tax treaty. Because the tax treaty, under the tax treaty, the bank will be governed by the provisions of Article 11 dealing with the taxability of interest. That Article 11 says that the interest paid by a resident of a contracting, or interest arising in a contracting state and paid to a resident of the other state. If one reads that entire article, the last paragraph of the article says that if there is a special relationship between the payer and the payee, then that special relationship will take into account only the arm's length interest, etc., etc. So, the entire article goes on the footing that there are two different people, a payer and a payee. Here, the branch and the head office are not two different people, and therefore the same theory, which was based on which the Delhi High Court had decided this issue, would still apply in a treaty situation where under Article 11 the taxability will not change merely because this provision has been amended in 915. That takes us to